Barkha Dutt's new book, To Hell and Back, is a memoir of COVID in India. It's written with passion and fury. She and her crew, in around 120 days, covered 30,000 kilometers and 14 states and union territories to bring you a report from the front lines of the greatest public health disaster in independent India's history. It's also a deeply personal book because it's also a memoir about Barkha's losing her beloved father to COVID. So I'd like to go to Barkha and uh, Barkha, what made you undertake this incredible trek? What made you get out of your very lovely Delhi home and go on the road and undertake this journey?
Thank you for having this conversation, Suketu. And like many things, and you know this as one of our most compelling storytellers, many things in journalism and storytelling are things you stumble upon. You don't plan them, you find them, and then your instinct tells you something about them, and then you go chasing them. So, something similar happened with me when Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced a lockdown, the world's largest, 1.4 billion people being asked to stay at home at 4 hours' notice. It was a televised national address at 8 p.m., and he said from midnight tonight, India will be in lockdown. To be fair, it actually seemed like the logical thing to do. Most of the world had taken the same approach. Why would India be any different? As a journalist, I was listed as an exempt essential service. That is, the media was an exempt essential service. But very few journalists of the visual medium actually got out in those early few days. The next morning, when I just drove casually to the borders of Delhi to see what was happening in the city on the day of this lockdown, I saw at the border of Delhi and Uttar Pradesh a flood of people leaving. There were men, women, children. I say in the book, their universes tied into a little sack on their heads. The children were often barefoot. It was hot. Most of the people I met didn't have food or water. At most, they had a sort of little bottle of water and a packet of what is in India called Parle G glucose biscuits, and they were walking. And when I got talking to them, I realized that they were walking a few hundred kilometers, in some cases more than 1,000, and they were going home. They were all daily wages. With the announcement of the lockdown and economic activity coming to a standstill, they had instantly lost their ways of income. And like you and me, at a time of uncertainty, they wanted to be with the people they loved. Why were they walking? India was among the few countries in the world to shut public transport as it closed the country down. So there was no other way for them to get home. And so, Ketu, in that instant, I realized that there was no way to tell or chronicle what was happening inside of a studio or in my home, from inside my home. I had to be among the people to tell the story, and so began the 2 years which in a way consumed me. My tryst with this pandemic, there's nothing else. I lived and breathed for the next 2 years, and that's how my COVID journey began.
The, the stories in your book really brought me to the edge of tears several times. They were horrific, but the way we that you get your people to tell you the stories, it's written with deep compassion and humanity. You're not a vulture out there uh, going among uh, the wounded and the dead for the purpose of extracting your story. What makes your storytelling so compelling is that at some point during the pandemic you were going through your own version of hell, which we'll get to later. But if you could choose a couple of these stories which on reflection now, um, after some time has lapsed, which are the stories that stay in your mind and why?
Yeah, it's interesting. I smiled in a sad sort of way when you used the word vulture and you said, I'm not one. And I smiled because one of the words most often used for me and some others like me who were out in the field, pounding the pavement, telling the story, most often by trolls on the right wing, was the word vulture. It was exactly that word that they used to vilify us, because somewhere by the time we got to the second wave, some sort of sort of fake nationalism had got mixed up with what we wanted to tell our people and the rest of the world about what was going on with the pandemic. And so, those of us who were out there trying to chronicle exactly how many people had died, how they had died, why they had died, and whether those deaths could have been avoided had the system worked better, we were all vilified as vultures. So, thank you for saying that when you read the book, that's not what you feel. Um, I You're right. I'm haunted by some of the people I met along the way. And that is why To Hell and Back is the name of the book, but it's also it's To Hell and Back, the humans of COVID. It's about the people I met and their lives and who they were and what made them uh, I don't know, try to live, what made them show resilience in extraordinarily difficult times, what made them give up, what made their hearts break, and what made them hope. What stays with me is in particular, are the tragedies of two men. One was Mukesh Mandal. Like so many millions of others at that time of crisis, he was a daily wager. He worked as a painter at construction sites, and he would earn a handful of rupees every time he was called to paint at construction sites. And when the lockdown was imposed in the first wave, he, of course, lost all access to income. So now, how was he going to live? How was he going to feed his children? He sold the only asset he owned, Suketu, which was a mobile phone. In fact, that was the first thing that most poor people in India sold at the time. Later, others sort of pawned or sold the only little piece of family jewelry they owned or a little piece of zameen, land that they owned. But most people first sold their mobile phones. And Mukesh Mandal did that as well. He got 2000 rupees for that phone. With that 2000 rupees, he bought a table fan because it was very hot. He lived on the outskirts of India's capital. It was very, very hot already. He bought a fan for his family and his children. He bought some rations, some rice, some wheat, some lentils. He went and gave them to his wife Poonam. And the next morning, after he had done this, he took his wife's dupatta scarf and tied it to a bamboo pole and took his life. And when I went to meet his family, I discovered that the police had made his family, that was illiterate, could not read or write, put a thumb impression on a statement that they didn't understand that said that Mukesh was mentally unstable and so had been driven to suicide. But the family told us that that is not the case. He was extremely anxious about how he was going to earn, how he was going to live, how he was going to keep his children fed without a source of income. And it haunts me till this date. I kept going back to that family. I went back to that family a year later, and it was the first starvation linked death that I covered during this pandemic. And that's when I realized that for a country as stratified as ours, the humanitarian crisis was going to be just as grave, maybe even graver at times, than the medical crisis. So that's one story that stays with me. The other that really stays exemplifies the paradox of the Indian state. The Indian state, especially in the first wave, was either absent or there was too much of it present. So when it needed to be there, benevolent, maternalistic, compassionate, it was missing. For example, when the millions of workers were leaving in a mass exodus that has, of course, been compared now to the movement of people during partition, it was absent. It was nowhere to be found. Then the police was weaponized to stop these same workers who we could not look after, who we could not give shelter to or even 2 square meals a day to. And when the police themselves, frontline workers, themselves in the line of COVID fire, but when weaponized by the state against India's poorest people, um, it became, instead of a lockdown, a police enforced curfew. They became the face of 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 how cruel the state can be when it overreaches. And I remember meeting this rickshaw driver, Manoj, who was sitting and weeping, leaning against a police barricade in front of a public health hospital. And I asked him why he was weeping. I thought maybe he has COVID and he couldn't get a bed. And then he showed me his injuries, and he'd been beaten by the police because he was in violation of the lockdown. He had walked a little further than he was allowed to because he had no way to feed his children again. And the retail groceries, vegetables were priced at a cost that he couldn't afford. He was walking to the wholesale market to see if he could get vegetables for cheap. The police beat him and then dropped him outside this hospital hospital, which would then not treat him because it was a COVID only hospital. So those are the haunting stories that stay with me. But we'll get to this a little bit later in the conversation. There were also many moments of hope. There were moments of humanity. There were moments of people, Muslims and Hindus, reaching out to each other at a time when television channels were hate mongering, not even missing this moment to spread communal hatred in India. So there was a lot of heartbreak, but there were a lot of things that also gave me hope, and we can talk about that as the conversation goes along.
Thank You're right. At 0.55 beds for every 1,000 Indians and just 0.66 doctors for every 1,000 people, India should hardly have been surprised at what followed after the lockdown. And according to The Economist, almost 6 million Indians died. Um, was this the chronicle of a tragedy foretold? Could the state, should the state have handled COVID better?
Look, let's be fair. I think countries around the world, including, I know, the country that is partially your home, the United States of America, could have done better. For example, the American sort of refusal, in my opinion, to sort of do a better job of containing the anti-vaxxer movement feels deeply unethical at a time when so much of the world, especially at that time, didn't have vaccines. So, of course, in the same way, our government as well as our systems could have done way better, way better. And that, when we point that out, when we hold power to account, when we ask questions, we are somehow called non-patriotic. Those of us who do ask these questions is a travesty. And let me give you a few examples. I think the lockdown in the first wave, the decision to shut down public transport was a grave mistake. The invisibilization of the poorest of among our people was terrible. To then treat them as criminals for trying to leave the city and go home, which is what you and I would have wanted to do as well, was cruel. And so there were a series of mistakes. By the time the second wave came upon us, to believe that with those statistics that you just read out, we could enjoy exceptionalism, that somehow not as many Indians had died as a percentage of our population in the first wave, insulated us against the Delta wave when it came, was a kind of strange denialism, a deluded sense of exceptionalism, and that we ordered vaccines for our people only in January. The vaccines were ready and available to be purchased significantly earlier. And we ordered vaccines. Our first formal order for vaccines was placed only in the January of 2021. And only enough vaccines were ordered that, as I write in the book, could not even have inoculated half of the adult population of one major city like Delhi. So, of course, these were mistakes. Our refusal to count our dead, our refusal to tabulate how many people died because they couldn't get a bed because oxygen ran out in hospitals, our refusal to be transparent and to attack people who are trying to chronicle these stories. All of these are mistakes. Some mistakes were because of a lack of capacity. Some were from denialism. Some were from callousness. And some were just from not being, I don't know, being able to cope with what was a very fast changing pandemic where the science kept shifting. So, yes, we definitely, most certainly could have handled this better and differently.
So it seemed at the time of when there were these scenes of bodies just being dumped into the Ganga, and there were pictures on the front pages of newspapers all over the world of mass funeral pyres in Delhi, um, and holding of events like the Kumbh Mela, the super spreader events. Um, it seemed like there was no way that this would dent the popularity of the BJP, of Yogi Adityanath, of Narendra Modi. But here we are, a year later, and the BJP has come back like gangbusters in Uttar Pradesh, where you do, so much of your reporting. So what explains this? I know that there was fury among Indians, not just in India, but overseas. At the time, um, we here in America, Indians, dreaded every phone call from our relatives at home because we didn't know what it would bring. Just about every Indian family I know lost someone there. I myself lost two of my first cousins in Surat and Ahmedabad. My cousin Nainesh, my cousin Sandeep, who died horrible, horrible death alone in hospitals, begging for the medical supplies that they needed. Why didn't this dent the popularity of the ruling parties in the long term?
It's a great question, and I'll attempt an answer. I'm not sure it's the answer. I know that you've recently been traveling across India, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. And I think it's a complex combination of factors. The first is that when this crisis was at its peak, and I call the second wave in which you lost two of your family members, the 2611 of the health system, and I call it that because in the first wave it wasn't to this degree PLUs, people like us, who were impacted. In the first wave, it was the very, very poor who were abjectly hit. In the second wave in 2021, like you said, all of us knew someone who had either lost someone or we had lost people we love ourselves. Yet, this did not translate into electoral rage against either the central government or in the heartland against the Yogi Adityanath government. Why was this? One reason I think is, I don't know, for lack of a better word, cultural and psychological. What I found among the poor, and I have fewer reasons for the middle class and the upper middle class, but among the poor was a deep sense of fatalism and kind of sad resignation. It was almost as if their expectations of the Indian state were no better, that they expected to be dying on the roads outside hospitals that had shut their gates to them, or they expected to be this to be their fate. They expected this to be their lot. Maybe, you know, they have already suffered in trying to access a health system. There's no sort of concept of Obamacare, for instance, in India. There isn't that you can walk in and get guaranteed access to the health system, and the poor struggle with this already. If you look at the All India Medical Institute at any time of day in New Delhi, you'll have cancer patients who come from far and wide and spend days and days on the pavement trying to get a bed. So something you and I have never experienced, India's poor probably have already in other contexts. They also looked at the pandemic as something that was hitting the world. They looked at it as something that the most powerful countries in the world had not been able to do a great job necessarily of containing. Finally, I would say that at the peak of the crisis, the opposition was missing. This could have been the moment that India's opposition chose to be among the people, to walk with the workers, to be outside the hospitals, to be sort of at least maybe running shelters for migrant workers. You had a few people. There was a youth congress leader, Srinivas, for instance, who the BJP and its supporters reached out to because he was helping people get oxygen when oxygen ran short. So you had those somewhat isolated, ironic moments, but mostly the opposition came out to criticize the Modi government's handling of the pandemic after the pandemic was over. So people didn't really see any Gandhi moment. I mean, think of a Mahatma Gandhi and what Gandhi would be doing. Gandhi would be there among the people. There was no sort of mass outreach, even in this big national crisis, by any opposition leader of significance. And I think that sort of was a big factor. Then there are many other factors that Indians don't seem to see a compelling alternative. There is a welding of uh, uh, sort of Hindutva and nationalism. There are welfare schemes. Rations were being distributed, free rations in Uttar Pradesh, with Narendra Modi and Yogi Adityanath's face on those ration bags. For the impoverished to receive free rations was a very, very big deal, especially emerging from the economic distress of COVID. So it's a combination of sort of what I call welfare capitalism or welfareism, microeconomic schemes, very, very smartly targeted. The continued personality cult around the prime minister, the approval for strongmen, whether it's Mr. Modi or Mr. Adityanath, the absence of a compelling opposition, a deep cultural and fatalistic sort of streak in the Indian people, and the sense that the world was suffering too. It wasn't India alone. Remember, this is the state that forgave Modi uh, probably his biggest mistake, which was demonetization. Modi won after demonetization. So there is this kind of cult following that Modi is able to invoke, and as a storyteller, and you know about this, the power of storytelling in politics. He's excellent. He was actually able to present his record on COVID as having done much better than the world. And whether what was happening on the ground bore this out or not, people believed it more or less.
So, as things stand now, um, we in America and you in India can go out to restaurants without masks. We can travel on public transport. We seem to have overcome the pandemic, but there are troubling signs of new variants emerging, and we don't know what the next, where the next pandemic might be emerging, in what wet market or lab or forest. Um, do you think India is better prepared now for the next variant or pandemic? Have we learned anything about how to deal with these threats and to kind of head them off at the pass?
So I think that we learned some things from the first wave to the second wave. For example, in the second wave, we did not do a national lockdown. We left it to the states. We did not shut down public transport. By the time the third Omicron wave came, we weren't obsessing about administering drugs that had been proven to have no efficacy. In the first two waves, we kept administering ivermectin, even though Merck came out with a statement. Merck manufactures ivermectin saying this doesn't work for COVID. We kept giving people steroids, which have caused a series of post-COVID complications. Nobody in the world did that. By the time the third wave came, we were saying, no, don't do this. Don't go running to hospital. Remdesivir doesn't work. Don't take ivermectin. So yes, we learned from many of our mistakes, but I would argue at great cost. But the two things that really bother me that I think we haven't learned is one, we seem to privilege elections over everything else. So even when the Omicron wave, hit us, and it didn't hit us badly in terms of hospitalization and deaths, but when we weren't sure, you actually again had this bizarre spectacle where you were imposing night curfews on citizens, but you had politicians going out and campaigning for elections. This is exactly what happened at the height of the second wave, when all of your major politicians, including the prime minister, the Bengal election was unfolding. Local elections in Uttar Pradesh continued to take place. You had hundreds of government school teachers who were forced into election duty. When I say forced, I mean they didn't have a choice whether to turn up or not. And a few hundred of them died from COVID. And when the third wave happened, for all the things we had learned, we were still privileging electoral politics over everything else. And I remember arguing at that time, and I say this in the book, that it seemed really egregious to me that schools had not opened, but polling booths were open. So that's one lesson I think we haven't learned. The sort of, elections are more important, politics is more important than anything else. And the second thing I'm afraid we haven't learned is how to, um, you know, I don't think this is us as a country, but it's certainly sections of our media and it's certainly sections of our polity, how to infect the worst crisis with religious toxicity. So in the first wave, where the Tablighi Jamaat had a mass congregation, you had channels running hashtags called Karuna Jihad. And, the pandemic was used to vilify Muslims. If of course that congregation was a mistake, and it was something that the organizers, I think, should be penalized for, but we didn't apply the same standards to the Kumbh Mela, right? So when the same standards are not applied across religions, there's a certain level of toxicity that enters the conversation. You had television channels that use skull caps as their visual backdrop on which they would put the caseloads for the day of COVID. So subliminally, people started associating COVID with Muslims, and this went on for a few months. And so I just feel that that's the second lesson that parts of our media and parts of our polity have not learned. even as there were many, many hopeful stories of religious divides being transcended, and Muslims helping to cremate Hindus and even bury little babies, because in the Hindu tradition we don't cremate little children, and vice versa. You had Hindu volunteers doing the same for Muslims. But did we learn that lesson, to not to, at least in a crisis, not bring Hindu Muslim politics into it? No, I don't think we did. So those are the two things I still feel we haven't learned.
So you were speaking of schools, and one of my favorite stories in your book is the story of Jyoti Paswan, the girl who um, very memorably carried the 15-year-old girl who carried her father, who was a rickshawala in Delhi, on the back of her bike for, I believe it was 9 days to her village.
Yeah.
Um, and this story was amply covered by the national and international media. It was an incredibly heartwarming story. But you are the only reporter that I know of who actually did the follow up, who goes back a year later to her village to see what's happening. And you rode a bike with her to her school. And
Yeah.
there's this lovely picture of the school where she says, I really like to study. I just want to go back to school. And that's one of the few sort of hopeful stories in your book. So talk a bit about that. What was that experience like?
Yeah, what really, she's of course an extraordinary teenager, and her father had had this knee surgery, so he couldn't, you know, uh, be the person riding the cycle, so she had to do it. But with for all her resilience and her extraordinary courage, we forgot at that time that she was just a little girl. She was 15 years old. She was a school kid, and she was a girl. And I emphasize this because one of the things she told me is how she would cry every night of that, those sort of almost 9 days that it took for her to get back from Delhi to Darbhanga, her village in Bihar, how she felt unsafe. She didn't know what would happen to them when they would spend the nights on highways or in petrol pumps. And then you had all of these sort of, you had Ivanka Trump sort of tweeting about her as if she was a sporting champion instead of a child who had been compelled by great tragedy to do what she had to do. And I argued then, and I argue in the book, that while she's an extraordinary girl, and I'm delighted that her home now is the only pakka home in her village, people have given money, they've been able to build a house, people are offering to pay for her education, movies are going to be made about her. All of that is excellent, but it doesn't take away from the fact that a child had to do this, the fact that a 15-year-old was driven to do this, is not a story of triumph. It is in the end a story of tragedy. It is in the end of a story of a system that collapsed. She found somewhere the remarkable sort of fortitude and the forbearance to do what she did. But that doesn't mean that we as a country didn't fail her for placing her in that situation to begin with, Suketu. But yes, in that moment, when she said, "You want to go for a cycle ride?" and I cycled with her to her school, and I said, "What do you want to do? And do you have all these dreams?" And she said, "I just want to study, and I just want girls to know everywhere that they can." And the reason this is so important is because the pandemic is over, but schools, 2 years shut down. Survey after survey done by social scientists show that children have lost cognitive skills, language skills, social skills. But in rural India, millions of girls have fallen out of the school system because when the classroom turned digital, in homes where there was a smartphone and internet connection, if there was a boy and a girl, a brother and sister, only the brother had access to the digital classroom. And the girls are under renewed pressure to get married. Child marriage is something where the numbers of child marriages have actually come down in India, but activists say these 2 years have set us back enormously. Not everybody's had a happy ending like Jyoti, where they've been able to go back home, had people sort of fund them, support them, and support their dreams. Millions of Indian girls are not studying. They have not just lost 2 years of their education, they're not studying, and they're being pushed into underage marriages that obviously they want no part of.
Um, this is the most personal of your books, and it is where you talk about the death of your father. You're right. One of my father's favorite phrases used to be, "What cannot be cured must be endured." As a call to Stoicism, it was a great philosophy, even though as my sister and I got older, we would sometimes snap at him, as adult children do, for talking to us the same way in our 40s as he did when we were 14. When the lab confirmed he had COVID, I, desperate to buy time till I could think clearly, contemplated not telling him for a day. Ever tech savvy, he had already logged on and checked his own results by the time I could clear the fog in my head. He repeated his favorite phrase, but it was misapplied. My father, like hundreds of thousands of Indians, should not have had to endure what he did. My father did not have to die. It's just an incredibly moving passage, and if you don't mind, give us a bit more of that story of how you dealt with this incredible loss.
Yeah. So just first, it's important to understand for people who may not know me well that my father raised my sister and me as a single parent. My mother, who was also a journalist, died when I was 13, and my sister's 4 years younger. And we only appreciate now that he's gone the kind of freedom he gave us, which is very unusual even today for young girls to have had. And but like with everything else in life, unfortunately, we reserve our moments of deep appreciation for people that we love. Sadly, when it's too late, and we never tell them that enough when they're alive. Uh, why do I say my father did not have to endure what he did? Well, my father had had just a single vaccine, and he was scheduled for his second vaccine in the week that he was hospitalized for COVID. And I keep feeling that if the vaccine rollout had been earlier, if the vaccines had been purchased earlier, then his second shot would have been earlier. And of course, I believe and I think that had his second shot been earlier, maybe he wouldn't have died, because what the vaccine does is it doesn't guard you against getting an infection, but it is supposed to guard you against death and serious disease. So that is what I feel, and it haunts me that just had he got his second shot, maybe he'd still have been there with us today. Uh, when my father got COVID, I was in Gujarat, your home state, actually reporting. And, I didn't immediately go back to Delhi where he lived. And I lived with him till I was 40 years old because uh, the doctors decided that he should be managed at home. But a couple of days, and so we had to manage his treatment remotely. The other big irony of my life is this: I spent 2 years inside every COVID ward of significance in a PPE kit where I was allowed, with the consent of the hospital authorities. As a journalist, I was allowed to tell that story. But when my father was eventually hospitalized as a daughter, obviously I was not allowed to meet him. So I was really bothered by that irony that I had been this close to, I don't know, how more people than I could count who had COVID. I had been inside every hospital to report the story. But when it really mattered to me, because it was an isolation illness, my father basically died alone. And that really eats me up. Uh, I rushed back to Delhi when his fever spiked and the doctors decided that he had to be hospitalized. And here is where, of course, I have to own my relative privilege that they were, it was almost impossible to get a bed in the city. And my entire 2 years had been devoted to that story of people not being able to get beds, either because there were no beds or because where there were beds, there was no oxygen. So hospitals didn't want people dying on their watch, so they weren't admitting them. And I was able to use my connections, get him a bed somehow. And then the hospital said, "We don't have an ambulance to send immediately. So can you wait?" And I panicked and I called a private agency, which sent an ambulance, which turned out to be just a ramshackled, repurposed Maruti van that had one sort of faded leather strip at the back on which we bundled my father up and made him lie down with his attendant. I jumped onto the front seat. I was a bit uncomfortable about my choice because there were no paramedics. There was just one long cylinder lying on the floor with one sort of little limp mask. And I thought, am I doing the right thing? And then I was just panicked. So I was like, no, 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 maybe we shouldn't wait for the proper ambulance to come. Let's just rush him. And then here we are with no green passage for ambulances in the city, an entire row of ambulances, perhaps many daughters ferrying their fathers to hospital, getting stopped at police barricades because there's still a lockdown that the police is still being used to impose, and so that's stalling the ambulances. We somehow get to the hospital and we discover that the cylinder has not worked as it was meant to have. COVID was treated with high flow oxygen, so the oxygen needed to be administered at a certain sort of volume and speed, and that hadn't happened. And he was supposed to be admitted to a general ward. When we reached the hospital, he had deteriorated massively. The cylinder had not worked, and his oxygen levels had plummeted. And the hospital said that he would now have to be taken to the ICU, but there was no ICU bed. So he sat there in his wheelchair in the foyer of the emergency wing of the hospital. And of course, I was begging, Dr. Naresh Trehan, who very kindly helped me. But here I was, the news having come home. I was the very story that I had been reporting, and it felt really strange and surreal. And I couldn't think straight. And I somehow managed to get him in an ICU bed. And I never met him again. 5 days later, he had died. Um, he was hard of hearing, so I couldn't even do proper video calls with him. And my last memory of him is him saying to me through a mask, "Say, I'm choking." And what he meant was that he was finding it difficult to breathe. The doctors obviously did the best they could, and I'll always be eternally grateful that we had at least that bed for him and that care for him that he had in the last 5 days. But when he died, we couldn't bring his body even back to his home because it would have technically meant crossing a border, because this hospital was in Gurgaon, which is in another state, in the adjoining state to Delhi. And so we had to cremate him at the cremation ground right next to the hospital, and there was no space at the cremation ground. And these are the stories I'd spent months doing, that the cremation grounds were running short of space, and now it was happening to my own father. There was a fight that broke out between families. We had to call the police, and the police then helped us cremate my dad. And I came home, and that day I got a fever and I tested positive for COVID. And then I think, I don't know whether that became my excuse or my shield not to process my grief. I didn't know what to do with myself. Now I had COVID. My father had died. I couldn't go out to report. So I would sit in the basement of my house and just keep working with, and everybody looked at me like I was strange, and I felt strange. And of course, I would cry all the time, but I was not able to do anything but work. It was like almost the only sort of thing that made sense to me anymore. And then when I uh, got free from COVID, I went out to UP, where I then took a journey along the Ganga to report on the mass shallow graves of bodies that had washed ashore or been dumped into the river. And Suketu, it's going to be a year this month, and I have not been able to climb up to the room in which my father lived. I used to live in the room till I was 40 years old. Across, we had a common bathroom separating our two rooms. I'm not able to climb up the steps. I'm not able to listen to music. I'm not able to go to New York, where you are today, because I found a pair of tickets that he'd booked to take us to New York later this year. And one of the things I had messaged him, one of my last messages to him was, "Get well soon, and I'm going to take you to New York." And so now I've scared to go to New York because I have that memory. He lived there for a few years as an Air India official. It was the city he loved most in the world. And so it's just, yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I've dealt, but it was also very odd to be the chronicler of COVID and then have the story come home.
Well, I certainly hope you come to New York. Um, and I'd like to play a song for you.
Why are there so many songs about rainbows? And what song and sailors. I think they are one and the same. I've heard it too many times to ignore it. It's something I'm supposed to be, and someday I'll find it. The rainbow.
Thank you for playing that.
Uh, a song for you and for your dad.
Thank you.
Thank you for writing the book that you did and for having the courage to write through your pain. Big hug.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was my father's favorite song, and we grew up on that song, and it's even today really difficult to hear it. But thank you for playing it. I end the book with it. It's my, I don't know, it's my entire life in that song. That's how it feels. So thank you.
Bye.